Welcome to Candid Conversation number 767. Today's question: why did it take God so long to send Jesus to die on a cross? After all, in Genesis chapter 3, Adam sinned. God puts him under the curse. And at the same time, I shouldn't say God, but he's under the curse because he sinned. And then at the same time, God tells Satan that he is going to basically send Jesus to die on a cross. I mean, he doesn't say those words, but that's what he's promising there in Genesis 3:15, that he will send, it says, the Redeemer there who will bruise Satan's head, and Satan will bruise his heel. And so that's referring to the cross. So the sin occurs with Adam, and God provides the solution. He says, well, this is the solution, that I'm going to send someone who's going to bruise, the seed of the woman is going to bruise the head of Satan. So, but yet it's 4,000 years later before Jesus dies on a cross. Why does it take so long? God makes the promise. Why does he wait 4,000 years? And the answer is all has to do with man's free will. Just like our question yesterday, why did God allow Satan to tempt Eve? Is the free will, God's desire is for all people to be saved. There are two parts to our salvation. The first part is that Jesus Christ shed his blood, so he had to provide the atonement for our sin. And the second part is we have to, in this current dispensation, trust in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for our sin. And that's the reason that God waits to send the cross for 4,000 years after he makes the promise in Genesis 3:15, is because man, for the first time, when you get to after the cross, for the first time, people are starting to be saved. I shouldn't say large groups of people, but people as a whole then are starting to hear the gospel and believe it and be saved. You don't have that before. It takes 4,000 years to build that up, basically. In other words, if God sends his son to die, he could have done that in, say, Noah's day, for example. It seems like Les Feldick mentions a book that someone has written, and offhand I can't remember it, but saying that the technology that was available during the days of Noah is the same pretty much technology as there is today, that they had same advancements back then, and that God destroyed the whole world with a flood, and so that technology was destroyed. Man had to start all over. Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So I don't think it's any coincidence that technology gets to where it is in Noah's day, and that allows man to have a greater wickedness or evil, and so they got us to destroy the society. And then we have technology today, and I don't think it'll be long before you've got Jesus coming back, because we're getting toward that time like it was in the days of Noah, and him having to destroy that world. Technology allows man to get more sinful, basically. If you wanted to be involved in sexual sin 150 years ago, you would have to do some things. You might have to find a prostitute, or do some go to some seedy areas and figure this out on how this is going to work. But today, you can use technology to commit that sin, and so it's. I realize it's not the same, but you can get a lot more wicked and evil because of all the virtual realities that are out there. Anyway, that's not our topic. Our topic is, why did it take 4,000 years after man sinned before God sent his son to die on a cross? And the reason is because man is so prideful that it wasn't until then that man would finally believe the gospel. That's one part. Then the other part is, man had to get so evil and wicked that he would actually kill him on a cross. Jesus said in John 12, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me." And the next verse says he was signifying what death he should die. So he had to be lifted up on a cross in order to reconcile both Jews and Gentiles back to God. It was the Jews who sentenced him to die. It was the Gentiles who actually did it, who actually executed him. So the world had to get that evil. You think of, for example, in days of Abraham, God says, here's the promised land, Canaan. He defines the borders in Genesis 15. He tells them, this is the borders of the land that you're going to have. But your descendants are going to be as strangers and be afflicted for 400 years. And then they will come forth, and then they will have this land. So he gives them the promise, but it takes 400 years. Well, why? Well, he tells Abraham there in Genesis 15, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should be saved. So he says the Canaanites, they deserve to die for their sin, but there's still going to be some that would be saved. So because just like in the days of Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah, God says he would not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 10 righteous souls there. It shows how evil and wicked the society had gotten. God allows man to get evil and wicked before he will destroy him, because his desire is for people to be saved. In Noah's day, he says, every thought of man's heart is only evil continually. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and yet God waits 120 years after he makes that statement and has Noah build an ark for 100 years before he actually destroys the world. And the reason is because if God destroyed them at that time, when he told Noah to build an ark, Noah would have been saved. But by waiting 120 years, now Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives are saved. So it goes from, so God is willing to wait and suffer with wicked and evilness. Habakkuk 1, God says, it says that God's eyes are too pure to behold evil. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil. Habakkuk 1, either 13 or 14 says that. And yet God is willing to long suffer with man's evil, his wickedness, for 100 or 120 years, so that 7 more souls may be saved. Not just Noah, but Noah's family. And so God doesn't want to destroy people until it gets to the point where there's no one to be saved. In Matthew 24, Jesus says that the times of the tribulation will be shortened. And if they're not shortened, meaning if they go beyond the 7-year period, then no flesh would be saved. So it's really a twofold thing there. It's God, first off, the reason he waits 4,000 years is because man would not be saved, would not believe the gospel. If God sent his son to die, I mean, he could have done it in his sovereignty, I guess, and overrode man's free will and just had sends Jesus and have him die on a cross. And they probably would have done it in Noah's day, as wicked as they were. He could have sent Jesus, and they probably would have done it not overriding man's free will. They probably would have crucified him on a cross. So there's nothing new under the sun. So, if they're that bad then they probably would have done that. They probably would have killed Jesus on a cross. So God waits to try to save as many people, but then he also, the reason it's 4,000 years is because that's how long it takes man to finally overcome his pride. What happens through history, just briefly, is that God makes man, Adam, man sins, Adam, you got 10 generations, and you get to the point where the whole world is evil, and the thoughts of man's heart's only evil continually in the days of Noah. So then God destroys all unbelievers, so that leaves Noah and his family to be saved, and everybody else is destroyed. And then God starts over again, and then you got 10 more generations from Adam to Abraham, and God destroys the world again. Well, he doesn't destroy them in terms of killing them, but there's the Tower of Babel where the whole world is united against God. And he says, if I don't stop this, then no one's going to be saved. So he confounds the nations. He puts them into creates different languages at that time, and divides the world into nations. He gives up on the Gentiles. He starts, so basically when God treats everybody the same, which he does from Adam to Tower of Babel, the result is everybody is in unbelief. Everybody's wicked. Everybody's evil. So there's no point in sending Jesus to die on a cross from Adam to the Tower of Babel. You've got about 2,000 years right there, because all of man is just evil. They're wicked. They won't believe God. So he could send his son, and being evil, they would have killed him, saying Noah's Day on a cross. They would have done that, but people wouldn't have believed the gospel anyway. So why do that? So it takes basically 2,000 years, and then the two catastrophic events of the flood and the Tower of Babel, basically to purge out all the wicked or evilness, and there's very few saved there. Enoch is said to have walked with God. Men began to call upon the Lord at the end of Genesis 4. That is, Seth is there in the days of Seth. There are people. So it seems like there are some people who are believers, but very few. Some will take the end of Genesis 4 to say that's men blaspheming the Lord, and that could be. But either way, even if it's men calling upon the name of the Lord to be saved, there are very few who are doing it. In Noah's day, Noah is a preacher of righteousness for 100 years, and the result is only 7 souls other than himself are saved. So you could see that the world is, it just takes 2,000 years of this wickedness and evil just going on, where man refuses to believe God. You see it right away with Cain. God says to Abel and Cain, bring the sacrifice, and Cain won't do it. And so there's all this evil and wickedness. And so then, after the 2,000 years at the Tower of Babel, God says, well, then the only way people are going to get saved is I got to play favorites. So he treats everybody the same for 2,000 years. Then for the next 2,000 years, God plays favorites. And he says, I'm going to make the Jews above the Gentiles. I'm going to give the Jews favored nation status. And when you look through that, you see that they're unbelievers as well. Romans 9 talks about how in the days of Egypt and Moses, days of Moses, Moses was a believer. Who else is saved there? Joshua, Caleb. Is anybody else saved? I don't know. I know at least those 3 people out of the 2 million in Israel are believers. Maybe there's some others. Maybe Aaron. Maybe Miriam. Maybe a few others. But from the scripture, all I could say for sure, out of the 2 million plus Israel who was led out of Egypt, 3 are believers for sure. Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. That's pretty sad. A nation of 2 million, God sends all these plagues to show that he is the true God, and yet only 3 people believe. That's pretty pathetic. So, again, the 2-step process in being saved is God has to send his son to die on a cross to be the atonement for sin. And then the second step is man has to believe the gospel in order to be saved. And you can see that very few people will believe. After the Tower of Babel, it's 5 generations from Noah to the Tower of Babel to Eber. It was in the days, or not Eber, Peleg. It was days in Peleg when the earth was divided. Genesis 10 tells us. So there's 5 generations from Noah to Tower of Babel. It's another 5 generations from Peleg to Abram. God says, I'm going to give up on the Gentiles, and I'm going to start my nation, the Jewish nation. Well, the next generation after Peleg, I believe, if I got it right, is Eber. Eber is where you get the word Hebrew. You can see Eber is part of Hebrew. Eber. You see how the similarity is. That's where the word Hebrew comes from. And you can see from Genesis 11 that it seems like God, it appears that God gave the same promises to Terah, which is Abram's son, that he gave to Abram. But the Joshua 24 tells us that Terah served other gods. He wouldn't abandon his gods to serve the true God. So it seems like that when the earth was divided, God tried to start the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, with Eber. Eber is the Hebrew. But it took 5 generations until you get down to Abram, where someone actually believes God. So it shows you how wicked, how evil man is. And then when you've got the days, and I mentioned Egypt, God bringing Israel out of Egypt. It's Romans 9 talks about how Israel was in unbelief at that time. Obviously, 3 people out of 2 million are believers, so they're in unbelief. And then, of course, Egypt, they're in unbelief as well. And Romans 9 talks about how God decided to show mercy to Israel and not destroy them. You know, he could have started over with Moses. He even says that in Exodus 32. God says, let my anger wax hot against Israel. I will destroy them, and then I will make of thee a great nation. You start all over with Moses. Moses asked God not to do it. So God, in his mercy, is long-suffering. So even though Egyptians and Israel are both unbelieving nations, God shows mercy, according to Romans 9. Whom he will have mercy, he shows mercy, and whom he will harden, he hardens. And it's up to God. He has power over the clay to make one lump to honor and one to dishonor. And the reason Romans 9 tells you, the reasons that he did that, the reason that he did not destroy Israel, since they're no better than the Egyptians. If anything, they might even be worse. I don't know if that's possible. But the reason he did that was because God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long-suffering the vessels of wrath, Romans 9 tells us. He endures for 1,500 years with an unbelieving nation, the nation of Israel, because he wants to make his power known to the Gentiles. And so then, when you get to after the cross, God starts the dispensation of grace with Paul. And for the first time, you have many people being saved. And there are people in the Old Testament who are saved, you know, but it's just a handful. You know, Samuel, David, Solomon, maybe, probably, Elijah, Elisha, the prophets, you know, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those prophets, Lamentations. No, that's not a prophet. So you got these, I laugh at my own jokes. Somebody should, I guess. But you got these people every once in a while who believe in the Old Testament, but you don't have a group of people believe until you get to after the cross with the Gentiles. Now remember, the Gentiles, they wouldn't believe when God treated them just the same as the Jews. Well, there were no Jews. They were all, everybody, one speech, one language. So Gentiles, people would not believe. God destroys them at Noah's flood. Again, Gentiles wouldn't believe, Tower of Babel. God gives up on them. And it's not that the Jews were any better, as we see in Moses' day, comparing the Jews to the Gentiles. It's just God says, the only way I'm going to get people saved is I've got to show everybody's a sinner and show that both groups, both Jews and Gentiles, are under sin. But I'm going to show favor or mercy to the Jews. And so then, if I do that for 1,500 years, in spite of the fact that they're all unbelievers, then what that does is it shows that the problem isn't with God, it's with man. So even though God chooses a special people and sets Israel above the Gentiles, they still aren't saved because they're so wicked, they're so evil. And it takes all that time before the Gentiles finally learn the lesson when you get to Acts 9 with Paul. Now, the Gentiles finally learn the lesson that there is none good, no, not one. That there is none righteous, no, not one. That all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You don't have those conclusions until you get to Romans 3. Now, I understand none good, none righteous. You can see that in the Psalms. But all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. that conclusion isn't until Romans 3:23. Romans 3 verse 1 says, we have before proven all under sin, both Jew and Gentile. The Gentiles are proven under sin at the Tower of Babel. The Jews are proven under sin at the stoning of Stephen. God gives up on the Jews, gives up on the Gentiles, Tower of Babel, gives up on the Jews, stoning of Stephen. Of course, when he does that, he's really putting both on hold. So then God starts saving Gentiles with Paul in Acts 9. He'll start saving Jews after the cross. After the rapture. And you can see that in Romans 11. So if you want to know why God waited 4,000 years to bring the cross, you read the last half of Romans 9, you read the last half of Romans 11. And in that you find out that God endured with Israel with much long suffering for 1,500 years, calling that nation his people, even though they were unbelievers. And he did not destroy them, but he let them survive. And what that did is that taught the Gentiles the lesson that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. And so then God says, okay, now I can start saving people. And he starts saving people with Paul and the Gentile. Now, in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul says he's speaking the mystery. This is something new. And the reason it wasn't revealed before is because if the princes of this world had known it, 1 Corinthians 2:7 says, if Satan and his forces had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And so the cross is a mystery. It's kept secret until you get to Paul. Because you don't really need to know how you're saved until you get to the point where people are actually going to be saved. And so God waits on the cross to the point where people are finally going to believe. And that's the Gentiles starting in Acts 9. And then for the last 2,000 years, God's been saving the Gentiles. And when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, the Jews require a sign. The Greeks seek after wisdom. The sign, Jesus says, the only sign I'm going to give this evil and adulterous generation is the sign of the prophet Jonas. And the sign of the prophet Jonas is seen with resurrection. And when the body of Christ is resurrected from the grave at the rapture, then that is a sign to Israel. And now Israel will finally believe. So the Gentiles, they have to see God showing mercy to a bunch of unbelievers for 1,500 years before the Gentiles will believe. And the Jews, God has to see, God showing mercy to believers and saving Gentiles for 2,000 years, or maybe longer, before they will believe. And that's where the end of Romans 11 comes in and tells you that. And so then, after the rapture, now Jews will finally be saved. But you don't really have a group of people being saved until 4,000 years in. And it takes all those events, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and God's suffering, much long suffering for 1,500 years with Israel, before you finally get a group of people, the Gentiles, believing. And that starts in Acts 9. And so basically, it takes 4,000 years for a man to overcome his pride and actually believe God and be saved. And so until that period is over, then God, once he says, okay, now people are going to be saved, so now I'm going to send my son, die on a cross for their sins. And then they can believe that gospel, trust in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for their sin, receive the free gift of eternal life. And then once we're raptured up, the fullness of the Gentiles come in. The rapture is a sign to the Jew, and then they will believe. So God delays the cross for 4,000 years because it takes that long for man to overcome his foolish pride and actually recognize his sin and turn to God for salvation. Thanks for watching.